Lovely. Thank you very much, Charles. Let me just... Right, well, the area we're going to be focusing on today is the Sahel, and particularly Niger, which is to the right of center there. I'll just introduce you very briefly to the map. The Sahel, which I'll talk about obviously in much more detail, politically covers Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, which is down below Mali there. It's really defined, or used to be defined, very much in environmental terms, rainfall and vegetation. And the word Sahel literally means in Arabic shore. So we're really talking about the shore of the Sahara. So it's that area that runs right across those countries where the desert turns into sort of scrub, then eventually savanna. So it's a pretty inhospitable environment, and it's defined in environmental terms, but it's become defined more politically now because of all the troubles there. Before July the 26th, that was the coup in Niger, the Sahel was one of, without doubt, the least known parts of the world. Very few people knew where it was, and it didn't really get an awful lot of attention, except perhaps by people like us. At the time, the BBC gave it quite a lot of coverage, and they really sort of ramped up its importance. The points that they focused on were the geographical importance of the Sahel as a region, which is sort of interesting. When I first heard that, I thought, wow, BBC are now, realized the Sahel is important. They portrayed it, this is the BBC talking, not me, as a sort of a bastion of democracy, which represented hope for Africa, hope for people, Democrats. They focused on the question of the migration threat, particularly concerns to Europe of migration from Africa. They focused on the importance of uranium, major export, from Niger. And they've also raised concern about the presence of Russia's Wagner group of mercenaries in the area. In addition to that, what I would emphasize here, people always say when people go to a lecture or listen to a webinar, well, they only come away with 1 point. If you're lucky, maybe 2. If you do come away with just 1 point, it is this, that what now happens in the Sahel, and is happening as we speak, will have widespread regional implications and even global implications. So the Sahel has come, if you like, from nowhere to center stage, literally in a few weeks. And I've already more or less said politically and geographically where it is. So it's now become and is used very much as a political region. People talk about the Sahel as a political region. The issues to be covered, I'll cover today, the causes and the course of Niger's coup, its position in the wider Sahel. G5S is a French acronym for Group 5 du Sahel, the 5 Sahel countries, which formed some sort of military alliance, which has never really come to much. But the importance of that, and I'll refer to it. Its deteriorating security situation and the rise of, I use the word jihadism rather than terrorism because it has a more specific meaning. The origins of what I call the Sahel War. This is the increasing conflagration that's been going on at least for the last 10 years. So the origins of this, where did it come from, which are important. I'll talk about the collapse of French influence in the region and also the reasons for its military failure. Also, Russia's involvement, increasing involvement and escalating political tensions associated with that. The problem of, or the question of migration from North Africa to Europe, and particularly the important area, the implications of all this for security, migration, the economy, geopolitics in a wider sense, and various proxy interests. A lot of other countries are sort of sticking their noses into the Sahel now for various reasons. Also, I'll touch on what I think may well be the future of this area, and that is the fragmentation of the Sahel into other regions and the implications of that for the wider region. And this idea that we're hearing a lot of now, a new world order, whatever that may be. Reasons for the coup I'll go over very quickly. The pushists themselves, they claimed at the time that this was because of the security situation, which was getting worse, and poor economic and social governance. I should say that, in fact, all three of those were at their best at the time. They have been for some years. So the pushists' claim for the coup is really a lot of rubbish. The real reasons for it, and I should say that neither Russia nor the jihadists were behind this coup. They did not induce it, as some people have been saying. There's no evidence for that. There's evidence of a lot of other things, but not Russia or the jihadists being directly behind the coup itself. Rather, it focused on personal ambitions, particularly of General Chiani, who was head of the Presidential Guard, who started heading up the coup and still does now. He was going to be dismissed that morning. So to save his bacon, he thought he would turn the table. So he sort of declared the coup. He's part of a much bigger problem. And that's the problems that have been facing the president ousted, that is Mohamed Bazoum. Bazoum took over from the previous president, President Issoufou, and his ruling PNDS party. And the problem is really one of Issoufou, the previous president, who had far greater ambitions, one of which is to become Secretary General of the United Nations. And one stepping stone of that was to show he was a true democrat, hand over power after his 2 terms, unlike most countries around Africa these days, so it seems. And he handed over democratically through an election where his successor had been well groomed to take over, and that is Mohamed Bazoum. But Issoufou left many of his placemen in power. He became very corrupt in his last few years, and he placed a lot of dead wood, if you like, around corrupt dead wood around Bazoum. So Bazoum's hands were very tied when he took over power a couple of years ago. And I was having a conversation with one of his advisors about 2 weeks before the coup, and they were saying, Bazoum's really got to face up now. He's got to get rid of some of this dead wood, or he'll never be able to implement a lot of his ideas economically and so, which were very good. So at the time of the coup, he was certainly planning to get rid of some of this dead wood, which included Issoufou's son, Minister of Petrol, and one of which was General Chiani, who sort of got there in the nick of time and turned the tables. So a lot of the problems behind the coup go back to the previous president and how he's tried to keep influence in the area, if you like. There's another issue which I don't hold to, which is one of ethnicity. Bazoum is an Arab. The majority of Nigerians are black, mostly Hausa people from the south. Arabs are very small in number in the north, along with the Tuareg. The fact that Bazoum is an Arab might mean that he gets a little less support in the south, but I don't like that argument. He's been around a long time, and I don't really think there's an ethnic card to be played here. The course of the coup, I'm not going to dwell on. It's a month old now. First of all, it was very uncertain who was really behind it. Well, we now know it was a group of Chiani's friends. I'm not sure the army is really very united on it. They're saying they are, but I think there are doubts in there. And the response of ECOWAS, that's the regional bloc of 15 countries, was very quick. They deplored it. They immediately said there were being sanctions and they would use force to throw the coup out. I should say that ECOWAS has a very long, bad tradition of stepping in against coups. It's never really done a great deal. It's more of an economic regional unity than a military force. But there have been so many coups in the area, which I'll come on to, it was sort of like a last chance saloon for ECOWAS. If ECOWAS didn't do something now, it would really lose all credibility. So that needs to be taken into account. There's been very little overt internal resistance to the coup. I thought there might be in the first couple of days because Bazoum was doing a good job. The only real statement of resistance has come from a guy called Risa Agbula, old friend of mine. He's a Tuareg up in the north. He's an old rebel. He's got a long track record of that sort of thing. And he set up this organization here, the Council for Resistance on behalf of the Republic. On the 28th of the month, he then said he was taking up arms. I think he's actually in Paris at the moment. I don't think he's around. I've tried to be in contact with him, but he's not saying much. And I don't think he'll get much of a following. He's not a leader. And I think he's a bit of a busted flush, quite frankly. And I say that he's a friend of mine. But politically, I don't think he's going to feature very strongly. Certainly, he's not going to get followers taking up arms. That's my impression at the moment. Because nobody wants violence. There's been a lot of statements saying we do not want bloodshed. And that's coming from everyone. The pushists, people, even people in ECOWAS, a lot of resistance really for the use of violence. So that does not seem to be on the table, or up front just at the moment. And the other outside powers, the pushists significantly haven't really been talking to anyone. They've taken a pretty hard line, not prepared to talk to anyone very much. Victoria Nuland from the States went to see them and they gave her the brush off. The only people they have been talking to is last week or two has been Algeria's foreign minister. Not sure how much talking they've done, but Algeria is trying to show that it's a mediator, which looked as if they may have been making a bit of progress in this last week or two, until a couple of days ago when Bazoum himself said he would have nothing to do with Algeria's intervention in this. Algeria's never done Niger any favors. In fact, it's been a troublemaker in the area for a long time. There's no treaty with Algeria, and he's not prepared to have anything to do with Algeria's intervention. He said it's very simple. I'm the president. Either I'm put back in power or nothing. So things are reaching an interesting point there. In terms of the wider Sahel, well, you've probably heard this expression. Niger is now being talked of as the last domino to fall. This is in terms of the coups in the region. It's really been the last country in the area to stand out, if you like, for reasonable friendship to the West. It's with France in particular, and the West is looking at Niger rather as its last hope in the region. And I think this is why the BBC has really ramped it up and is giving it so much importance. And it's also, I think, true as well. Since 2012, the whole region, Niger included, has been the focus of increasing terrorism or jihadism, and that is increasing, and I'll talk about that in a moment. In 2013, France intervened militarily at the request of Mali initially to overcome this jihadist threat in the region, which was sort of taking over a lot of these areas. And France started off, or actually secondly, with Operation Barkhane, which was the insertion of 5,000 French troops across the region. With those French troops, they brought together the 5 countries in a military alliance, G5S, never been very effective at all, plus quite a few European contingents, mostly fairly small, but Germans, a few others, a few hundred each, plus a very large UN force of peacekeepers in Mali, about 12, 13,000, depending on how you measure them. A list here of, the coup d'etats. I won't run through all of them, except to say there have been 7 in the region. This is in the Sahel in the last 3 years. The dates are up above there. If you include Sudan, which is slightly different politically, that's 8. And these have resulted in the last year or two of, and going on now, the withdrawal of French troops from Mali and Burkina Faso, as well as European contingents, and MINUSMA, the UN forces, is moving out now. It's on the way out, and the G5S has effectively disintegrated. So you've got a rapidly deteriorating security situation combined with the rise of, or the continued rise of jihadism. And on this slide, they're really mostly a lot of statistics. I won't run through them all. They're all basically saying that the increase in jihadism, however you measure it, deaths of civilians, incidents, are reaching pretty horrific levels. 43% of global terrorism is now in this region, compared to 1% in 2007. That 1% is too high because that was mostly fabricated. It was almost zero. And we're talking about at least 5,000 civilian deaths a year now. These figures are all rising, and we'll talk about them a bit more. So they're really statistics. Jihadism's on the up. Where did this come from? And this is very important when we come to thinking about solutions to it. The origins of this Sahel war, as I call it, go back to around 2012. And there are three things that triggered it. And these are very important. One was Libya's 2011 rebellion against Gaddafi, NATO's intervention. This had a huge impact on the Sahel, probably the biggest, because an awful lot of Tuareg from this region who'd gone up to Libya to avoid the droughts, to find work, mostly had found work in Gaddafi's legions. Some had been recruited to help him against as mercenaries. And with the overthrow of Gaddafi, they all were sort of forced back out of Libya. They came back into the Sahel as an armed group or armed individuals, very angry with the world, with NATO and everyone else who had turned their lives upside down. And they joined up with old rebel fighters in northern Mali and formed this group, the MNLA, Movement National Libération pour Azawad, which this morning declared war again. I'll come on to that later. Niger handled this problem much better. Niger said, look, you guys are, have got problems. We'll incorporate you into the security forces up in the north of the country and around about. So Niger managed this problem. Mali didn't. And the result was that you have a declaration or a movement for independence of northern Mali called Azawad, which posed a major threat to Algeria. The threat to Algeria was Algeria has Tuareg in its south. The government's unpopular, and Algeria saw any type of independence movement on an ethnic basis on its southern borders a major threat. So it stepped in very dramatically, and it launched an Islamist insurrection into Mali. The object was to discredit the Tuareg nationalists, which they did, and they created DRS, that's the Algerian Secret Services. They created Islamist groups, Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, created by the Algerian DRS, Ansar al-Din, which is now changed its name. Its leader is the current leader of the jihadists in the region, Mujah, another group in the area, all created in around 2011. And the whole idea, to put it bluntly, was to mess up Mali and cause chaos, and that would discredit the Tuareg irredentists. And as you are aware, it all got out of control. Another character, Mokhtar was involved. And this led to a coup against Mali in 2012 by the army for pretty good reasons at that time, and Islamists taking over northern Mali. And importantly, the DRS in Algeria used this opportunity of chaos to literally relocate terrorists, as they were called then, from Algeria into the Sahel. So we get a shift southwards, literally about 2,000 kilometers of troublemakers from North Africa being pushed down into Mali, supported at that time by the Algerian DRS, and it got out of control, and we're paying the price for it now. That's one major cause for this route. The second one was that America's global war on terror, which really covered the decade before that, mostly 2002 up to about 2011. However, much of the so-called terrorism there was fabricated by false flag incidents. There wasn't a great deal of real terrorism, but the local governments, particularly in Niger and Mali, wanted largesse from the Americans' money, and they were encouraged to provoke local Tuareg into taking up arms, which they did successfully by being a nuisance, or literally sort of provoking the Tuareg and then branding them as terrorists. This was part of US policy, and which would be denied emphatically, but it was all revealed in 2016 when WikiLeaks published all the State Department documents covering this period. They're known as the US Bamako cables. So it was 400 odd cables which were taken by WikiLeaks, published, and basically the American diplomats in the Sahel were talking to the White House, State Department, and saying the real problem are the governments in Niger and Mali, not the Tuareg. They're not rebels. You've got it all wrong, and you are creating propaganda. This was very strong stuff. It's all been available now, but we didn't get it till 2016. And then The third reason, which is becoming more and more uppermost, is the whole question of France-Afrique, this anti-French sentiment, which is now rife across the region. France-Afrique, I won't go into detail, it was a political phenomenon, began in the 1950s, which saw the continuous subjugation of supposedly sovereign African states to France. These are the states we're talking about now. After the defeats of France in Indochina and Algeria, they thought it was wiser to have sort of nominally independent political control in the African colonies while keeping sort of tight rein on them. And this is a huge scandal. It goes back into the 1950s and onwards, when leaders that France wanted to run these countries were brought over to Paris. They were interviewed by Jacques Foccart, who was then de Gaulle's advisor, and de Gaulle himself. The candidates, it was very clear what they had to do. It was just to make their natural resources available to France and vote to France at the UN. In return, France would squash any political domestic scandals. They'd be ignored, and they would be kept in power as long as they were convenient to France. So you've got Biya, Davy, Ouattara, Bongo, all these people, and this is what these countries are now objecting to so strongly. So we're going to hear a lot more of France-Afrique. So we're seeing rapidly the collapse of French influence throughout this area and probably wider afield. To be academic about it, we can probably pinpoint it right down to one particular day, 13th of January, a summit where France called these countries together in Pau in southwest France, where they formed the coalition for the Sahel, which never came to anything very much. But the date was significant. It came a few days after 12 or 13 French soldiers had been killed in a helicopter crash. Two French helicopters crashed into each other's. And also a few days, weeks after two massive attacks on military bases in Niger, where a lot of Nigerian soldiers were killed by jihadists, 71 and 99, in two horrific massacres of Nigerian troops by jihadists. This really shook these countries. This was unprecedented. It's becoming a bit more de rigueur now and sort of daily. But at Pau, Macron behaved in the most arrogant manner, and it did not go down well in the Sahel. His message was, we are sacrificing our lives, you should be grateful for them. So he gave these countries quite a ticking off and said their job was to support France, because France was having its soldiers killed on their behalf. This did not go down at all well, and it led to a further rise of anti-French sentiment, and it's got worse since then. Why has France failed so abysmally on the military front? Two big reasons. One is it's treated the whole of the Sahel problem as a counter-terrorist war in the sort of American global war on terrorists sort of thing, a military solution. It's not that at all. It's become that, but it's mostly local grievances for lots of reasons I can't go into in time rise, but it wasn't just a straight counterterrorism war. Also, there have been massive failures on the part of French intelligence, which I still find almost incomprehensible, in their failure to understand much of these issues on the ground, particularly ethnic tensions, rivalries, which their presence, the French military presence, has made dramatically worse and has basically fueled support for the jihadists, or recruitment for the jihadists. Won't go into those more, but they're big issues and they're still big question marks, particularly the failure of French military intelligence. And Pau, I have mentioned, and in a sense, you can almost draw a straight line from Pau to the August coup in Mali, the first of these coups. Initially, these coups focused on the French military failures, but increasingly the focus is turning to France-Afrique issues. So the anti-French sentiment is moving from the failure of the military to the wider France-Afrique issues. And one should stress here that much of that is propaganda, much of it quite true, but it's being fed by the Wagner Group. And Prigozhin has been behind for several years, in fact, pushing out anti-French propaganda, anti-colonialist propaganda, focusing on the scandals of France-Afrique, which haven't really come to the fore so much until very recently. Now they're uppermost. So if Russia has been involved in these coups, it has been particularly in increasing propaganda, drawing on the scandals of France-Afrique. This has led now, of course, to the withdrawals of the French military from Mali and Burkina Faso. In Niger, what's going on with the French troops, not clear. France has issued a statement, which I saw yesterday, saying we're not taking troops anywhere because we don't recognize the government. The government hasn't told us to leave, so we're not paying attention to the pushists. Behind the scenes, I've been getting messages from Algeria, which could be exaggerated, that Algeria is trying to play a mediating role and claims to be talking to France, secretly to help find a way of moving French troops out of Niger. So that is a bit of an ongoing story there about what will happen to the French troops there. The Russian involvement in the region, again, this is becoming a big issue. Certainly the media, the press are playing on it, and Western powers, I think, are extremely worried by what it may be happening here and what may escalate and get worse. The whole Mali Wagner business, certainly the deal was done in September 21. Before that, there were certainly talks relating to mining concessions, and these talks certainly go back, I think, to the second coup in August of that year, maybe a bit before that, and they were about there. At that time, the time being December, so after the deal, about 500 mercenaries were reported to have arrived in Mali. That number's now risen to an estimated 1,000, maybe a few more, a few less. Very difficult to know the exact number. There were allegations at the time of the deal that Algeria was playing an important part in it. I should say there's no hard evidence for this, but it's often difficult to get hard evidence. But of the alleged bill that Wagner charges, $10,000 or thereabouts dollars a month, there were allegations that Algeria was chipping in on this and helping out. Algeria was also helping out by providing fuel into Mali, transporting Russians, Wagners, across Algeria into Mali. Again, no hard evidence, but strong allegations. The Wagner itself, the junta, the coupists in Mali, turned to Russia, not really to help on national security, because they've done virtually nothing on that front, but to make themselves, that is the military leaders, coup-proof, to protect the coupists, the military regime. Ostensibly, they're training local forces. There's not a great deal of evidence for that, except in some pretty savage stuff. And they are providing some sort of security for the junta itself. So they're a bodyguard, in effect. Also, their job, if you like, as far as Moscow is concerned, is to help spread Russian influence in the region and in Africa. They're doing an exceptionally good job of it, I would think, certainly through propaganda and other media ways, and also to secure financial gains, access to gold mines, etc., as in Central African Republic, and we're seeing that, in the Sahel as well, or beginning. Important in that they are behind pushing out much of the disinformation, which is helping to foment anti-French sentiment, which doesn't need a lot of fermenting because France has done a pretty good job on its own account through France-Afrique, but Wagner has been responsible there. Their record in the region is of basically some pretty horrific human rights abuses. I won't go into details here. Torture, rape, massacres all over the place. Two very big ones which received international attention. Village of Mura in March last year, when Wagner went in with some local troops. They finished up, the death toll was well over 500. Well, not well over, just over 500. That was the ultimate UN finding published on the 12th of May this year. Major crimes committed, horrendous situation. And just after that, but it didn't get the attention because of Mora was taking all the news. Another massacre in April, a few weeks later, a Wagner convoy was driving near Homburi, which is nearer to Gao. An IED went off and killed one. I think one Wagner soldier was killed. They lost it. They drove into Homburi. Market was open. They opened fire on the entire marketplace. 50 were shot dead. They picked up 500 civilians and detained them, gave them a pretty rough time. 20 were killed in detention, and so it's gone on. This morning, I've been getting reports, I haven't been able to access them because I'm dealing with this, of more moves by local people in the north against Wagner, and some pretty nasty incidents from what I've just seen from first glance. Not of the same scale as this, but fighting is picking up there, and literally as we speak. I'll come on to that later. How concerns their involvement in Mali? As I say, there's no evidence yet for the Russian presence in Niger. It may be there, but we haven't got hard evidence of it. But they are responsible, certainly, for much of the anti-French propaganda. A lovely photograph. I'm certain it's genuine because it was taken by a friend of mine, but I'm not quite sure of the exact location. He said it was on the route from down to Borj Mokhtar across into Mali from Algeria. And I thought it was 17. I can count 14 fuel tankers. This is Algeria supplying somebody in Mali with fuel. Not the first time that it's there, but the message I got was, this is making sure that Wagner would have access to troops. I can't vouch for that. The photograph is genuine. I think it's quite a dramatic photograph. Okay, implications of the Mali coup. First of all, security issue. The French, European, UN troops have left the area or are in the process of leaving. In Niger, there's still about 15 there, and I said just a minute ago, that's uncertain where they're going. So local security, as it is at the moment, is basically being left to the local militaries of the countries concerned. They are ill-led, ill-equipped, ill-trained, and not of any great, massive fighting potential, which partly explains why the jihadists have got the upper hand on most of the regions. The escalation of a myriad number of self-defense groups, often village by village. A lot of them are linked to the two main jihadist groups. I won't get into details here: Janim in Mali and Islamic State, Islamic State of the Greater Sahara, as it calls itself, largely for protection and for threats. If they don't join up with them, they'll get attacked. So you're getting this very messy situation of self-defense groups around villages having to survive in appalling conditions of being shot at by the army on the one hand and by the by the jihadists on the other. And this explains an awful lot of the violence. Wagner, which has absolutely no interest in the security of the region, indeed its intents are to make life difficult for the West, and wherever Wagner is, mostly in Mali, the escalation of violence and deaths, however it's measured, has gone up by at least 50%, nearer 100% since they've moved into the area. This provides those groups there, that provides a massive opportunity for the jihadists, almost giving them free run, really. The two groups, the Islamic State of the Greater Sahara and Janim, I'll call it by its name. Janim is led by Iyad Agrani, who goes back a long way. He's an old DRS agent. He still has strong ties to Algeria, and he's going to become a very prominent figure, as he is at the moment, in the future. In terms of whatever deals may be done, he's going to be prominent in amongst them. And I should just say he's probably got as many positives as negatives. He's a very ambiguous character, not to be underestimated politically or in astuteness. And we'll hear a lot more of him if he's still alive. So basically, jihadists are now on top. Statistics, if you want them, the best place to get them is accurate, highly accurate. Every incident is recorded by them. Their database is so complex, you need to be very skilled to work it, but it's there. So this increased jihadist activity Which areas are most vulnerable? There are two in particular, in my opinion. One is the Three Borders region. That is traditionally known as Liptako-Gourma. That is the area where the borders of Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso come together. That is particularly vulnerable. The provinces or regions within those countries, in Niger, it's Talabari, down just to the west of Niamey, a little bit further north, the Tawa region. In Mali, it's the Menaka region, which again is just north of Niamey. It borders Tilaberi. That whole area is now almost basically totally in the hands of jihadists. The other area which is particularly important, and I think I'll just flip back to the map just to help you on this, so that Three Borders area, the yellow roads, so ignore the roads, the borders are the blacky grey lines. If you go to Mali, the writing, go to the letter I at the end of it, go down 5 o'clock, 5:30, down to the border, go in the direction of Niamey. That sort of border area covering that bottom part of Mali, that southwest corner of Niger, and all of northern Burkina Faso, that is the three border areas. And this is where we can almost envisage the creation of some sort of Islamic sort of state or caliphate emerging in this area. This is a highly vulnerable area, and the militaries, we've been talking about Western militaries, UN militaries, are more or less out of that area. The other area which we will hear more about, and I'll talk about in a minute, is northeast Mali. If you go to, I can't make a pointer on the map, the sort of little kinks at the bottom of Algeria. If you go to Mali again, go up to 2 o'clock, 2:30 from the Eye of Mali, that area up there, the region is called Kidal. All that area is known as Azawad, the Tuareg name for it. The local Tuareg declared war again. I got the note from this morning, I think last night, against the Mali government, that's the junta, and Wagner. The jihadists have joined in with them, it would seem, on some sort of alliance, and they have issued a statement more or less saying that all this territory of northern Mali, you come into it at your peril. They're using the name Azawad again, so one can see almost a replay of 2012 coming to hand here. I can't give you much more details because they're behind my screen, but this does look ominous. It's been building up for the last few weeks. There have been incidents there, one of which you probably heard on the river Niger last week, 50 odd people, 49 to be precise, killed when the jihadists opened on a boat. The strategic message here is any form of transport is fair game. You keep out of northern Mali. Even if you come on the riverboat, which is about the only form of transport working these days, it'll get shot up. I say that because the roads are in such dilapidated state, they've just about collapsed. So those two areas, northeast Mali, and I'll come on to it in a moment, and the three border areas. Sorry, I need to go down to 24, I think I was on, 23, 4. Yeah. Okay. This group in the north, they call themselves CMA, Coalition to Movement Azawad, mostly Tuareg, few local Arabs in amongst them. So CMA is the acronym we're going to hear more of. They declared war last night against Mali. Take it, for what it's worth, but there is fighting going on up there. And there's been fighting during August between the Malian troops and CMA. Small numbers being killed, quite a few incidents around Bur, Timbuktu. The government bombed Anafis. I'm sure they aimed to miss because they missed quite dramatically, but I think it was just a warning shot saying this is what we can do. And they have been threatening to do that. Timbuktu itself has been under siege by the Janim, airports closed for several weeks now. And the attack on the Niger River transport is part of this strategic message. Don't come into northern Mali, or if you do, we're at war. The implications of this trouble in northern Mali instability for Algeria. It's a major threat again to Algeria. It hasn't triggered anything yet, but Algeria will be watching this extremely carefully. There's a possibility of a link up between the Tuareg in that area and the Niger Tuareg. So if the Niger Tuareg are attacked by the junta and or the Wagner group, or vice versa, there is potential for a cross-border link up there. I think it's still a little way off, but they're talking about it in rather loose terms, but it's happened before and it could happen again. If there is more fighting in the area, I think it'll become a greater regional threat than the Niger situation. That's putting my neck out, because the whole seminar webinars about the seriousness of Niger, what's happening in Mali could become even more serious if these ifs come about. And the overall threat to the region, which is already happening and has been for many months, a year or so, is the threat of jihadist expansion southwards down towards the Atlantic coast into Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Togo, Ghana, Senegal. There are encroachments down there. There have been a few incidents. With the removal of European troops, French troops and so forth, I suspect this will be accelerated. With the trouble in northern Mali, it may get another booster as well. So the threat to the countries south of the traditional Sahel is very high. If ECOWAS should intervene militarily, I don't think it wants to. It says it will do it, but I don't think it wants to. If it does, fighting, I think it's a big if, would certainly spread into Mali and Burkina Faso, who've already said that two other junta-led states, they will come and help the pushes in Niger. So we're almost getting a block forming here of pushes states. This could well draw in other powers. I call them troublemakers, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, all of whom are sniffing around the area. A proxy war between Morocco and Algeria. If ECOWAS was to use military force, Morocco would probably back them to gain, strategic position in the ECOWAS area. Also to carry on its proxy war with Algeria. Other proxy interests coming in, Algeria versus the UAE, which is getting a bit tense. There's a lot of animosity floating around the region, particularly in the loosely speaking Arabist world. And a lot of those sort of interests are already being played out in the Sahel. They could be accentuated by an ECOWAS invention. The West, EU and the US, preoccupied rather with Ukraine, Russia, elsewhere. In other words, Africa is not high on the agenda, but Africa could become, and I think is suddenly becoming, more important to the West. The Niger coup has acted as a catalyst here to focus attention on what could happen in Africa, the sort of things I'm talking about. Okay, the West has left the region to France up until now, but not any longer. So there is, a threat emerging there, and the West is getting a wake-up call. Military implications, statistics here, which may be useful. Migration implications is that whatever fighting takes place here will create another push on migration into Europe. And again, a few statistics here. And this is what worries Europe in particular. They've got good reason to worry now. The statistics on movements, people who've been displaced and so forth, are very high. They're real. We're talking about millions of people being displaced already, and they find their way up to the Mediterranean coast. And this is a threat to Europe. Economic implications of the Niger coup on Niger. Well, 40% of the budget came from foreign aid. Few statistics beneath here. How are they going to survive if foreign aid, which a lot of it's been cut already, continues? Again, the effect of sanctions are having already a very high impact, higher, I think, than any other country I know where sanctions have been imposed, particularly because of closing the border, cutting electricity. On the financial front, the local or the regional Union Économique, the monetary union for West Africa, has stepped in. Data here on closures of various accounts, default notices. So there's a major threat financially on Niger. It's already having an impact, certainly from people I'm talking about there, and particularly on commerce. The cutting electricity is causing big troubles, particularly through the south, shortage of foodstuffs, hence price rises, major disruption to commercial business. Niamey airport's open to flights, but you can't fly out, so you can't fly in because there's no jet fuel there. And there's questions about what's going to happen to the crude oil, the export pipeline from Agadem down to Benin. I don't think it's going to be blocked. It may be delayed a bit, but it's in the way, so to speak. Also, the Trans-Saharan pipeline is certainly going to be, if it's ever going to come about, will be pushed back. The economic implications of the hardship. So as this hardship is already biting in Niger, it's going to have serious consequences. Firstly, it's fueling anti-West, anti-ECOWAS sentiment. Okay, the pushes are blaming all this on the West. It's also fueling pro-jihadist sentiment. It's also fueling pro-Russian sentiment, and it's providing opportunities for what I call the meddling powers, Turkey, UAE, Morocco, Saudi, to fiddle around in the area and for various reasons. Wider implications. I think this will certainly be deterring any corporates that are looking at the area, major businesses. Would you want to go in to these countries with this sort of situation developing and possibly getting worse? And I know there are people in the audience who may be involved in this, particularly in the mining fraternity, gold mining, uranium in Niger. These big question marks must be hanging over these. How are they going to be affected? What about new investment and developments and so forth? For the region as a whole, there are and there have been a lot of major internationally funded regional infrastructural development schemes on the pipeline for some time. Bridges over the Nile, over the Niger, hydro schemes, all sorts of things in this nature, the Trans-Saharan gas pipeline. All these things are going to be on hold, and this just has huge damage to the region in terms of its ultimate development. And then, of course, there's this talk of the New World Order, and the Sahel is suddenly becoming a key player in whatever we're talking about here, this New World Order, which is predominantly non-West. It's sort of Russian, China, Russian, Chinese, BRICS, unaligned Algeria, anti-Western or not pro-Western, and whatever they're hoping to create there. Suddenly the Sahel, from nowhere, is beginning to become a player in that. What now happens in the Sahel? What are the wider implications? Well, French humiliation, it's not likely. I think it will continue. It's been driven by Russian anti-colonial propaganda. Moscow's objective is to weaken the West, to humiliate it, and they're doing a great job of doing that in this area at the moment. Hence, so much media attention on it. Disinformation becomes the mode of government. And this is a warning which you're all probably aware of. Very difficult to know what is true and what is not true here in terms of disinformation. I won't go into details of it, but the Niger pushes are already explaining the sanctions, hardships as consequences of French attempts to break the country's sovereignty, the people's will, and so on and so forth. So disinformation is in abundance, be warned. The region's coup states are really beginning to form an alternative bloc to ECOWAS. And I think this is quite an interesting development, quite a dangerous development, that these states stick together. Burkina Faso and Mali have already said, if you have any foreign forces come in, we will join you. So we're already seeing the emergence of a sort of bloc of couist states, and Niger is the last domino, if you like, in that area. There may be more to come. One looks to Cote d'Ivoire and the other Francophone states in particular to the south. I think this is highly possible, but down the road. I thought this for a long time. Both Mali and Niger, I say they're not proper countries in terms of traditional borders, which go back to colonial rules. The borders are all in the wrong place. They're crazy ideas, really. And there are tensions caused by them. There always have been. But the potential now for Mali to split is extremely high. Niger less so, but it could. We could see this. And the parallel, of course, is the French OCRS. This was a movement very people have heard of, Organisation des Communes des Régions Sahariennes. When France saw the writing on the wall in Algeria in the 1950s, they just discovered oil, and they thought, well, we'll give Algeria to the Algerians. We will keep the Sahara. And they came up with this region, sort of neo-colonial region called the OCRS, all of the Algerian Sahara, i.e. the oil, curving around, taking in the whole of Mauritania, which no one bothered about in those days. Morocco was out of it, they were to the north. Then cutting a line through the Sahel, very much on racial lines. Whites to the north, whites being Arab and Tuareg, blacks to the south. And those Tuareg and the Arabs concerned, they thought, yeah, that's quite a good idea. We would much rather have a continuation of colonialism than being ruled by either Arabs or blacks. They're all very racist, very nasty. It never came to anything because the Algerians at the 1962 Evian Accords said, forget it, we're having nothing of it, so put it in the dustbin. So the OCRS lived as an idea for 5, 6, 7 years. But you hear it being mentioned again now in this same context that I'm just raising it. Tuareg are using this word. They've forgotten about it. It's been resurrected. So that's something to watch. And if Niger follows Mali and Burkina Faso, it hasn't done so yet, but it's possible. And possibly other states, coup states, move in here. The Sahel will become a region, if it's not already, a region of political and security chaos, which it already is, I would suggest, with the three borders area possibly even becoming a jihadist caliphate, with possible attempts to expand out of that. And I think that is possibly where I stop, and hope I haven't bored you to death. And if you have questions, Charles will certainly take them.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Another tour de force. We've got a minimum of 5 minutes, maximum probably 10 minutes, just for a few questions. And there are about 5 or 6 already. So if we can have reasonably short, snappy answers. What's the tenor on the streets of Niger? Is there, in your opinion, a reason why Russian flags are being waved in combination with jubilation being pronounced over commercial media coverage? So yes, why are the Russians popular?
Yes, Russia has been festering, we call it trouble, in the region for several years. This has all been very predictable. You know, the Sahel's getting worse and worse and worse. Russia is aware of it. It's been, and it goes right back to colonial times, actually. Russia has been fostering disinformation. We're the country which is opposed to colonialism. We helped you during the colonial period, which is a bit debatable. And the propaganda of that message, of which there's a little bit of truth, not much, is being seized upon by young people in particular. There are Russian agents provocateurs in the region, particularly in Mali, forming Russian cultural associations. I think there's something like 14, 15 million members in Mali. I don't know where they've got. It's extraordinary. So there is this quite big push culturally in the lower levels, particularly with young people. They are seizing on this. The colonial period was before their time. They believe the propaganda, and it's in their faces. France-Afrique is real. So France is doing itself no favors at all on the France-Afrique front. And yes, we are seeing the emergence of quite strong pro-Russian sentiment, particularly amongst young people.
Okay. Theo says Algeria's role is somewhat curtailed by the fact it's seen as acting on behalf of France. If that's true, there's a power vacuum that allows Wagner to play things to its advantage.
Does Algeria act on behalf of France? Algeria and France are at loggerheads half the time and in bed with each other the other half. So it depends on which week you want to take literally. So the relationship, basically Algeria's position on the Sahel is it wants all French troops out. Algeria has never wanted French troops on its southern borders, least of all in the Sahel, which it sees as its own backyard. It didn't want the UN there. And it tried back in 2012. It went to absolute international global contortions in the UN to try and keep any form of external intervention in the Sahel out. It failed. France moved in. So Algeria would like all French influence out of the Sahel, if possible, along with any other foreign troops, unless they're friendly to Algeria. That raises the question about Russia. Yes, there is a close relationship between Algeria and Russia. There are allegations that Algeria has been helping Wagner. Not a lot of hard evidence, but I don't know if that answers the question. But the relationship between France and Algeria is a love-hate relationship. Indeed. It depends which week you're talking about.
All right. If Bazoum is not reinstated, will projects in Niger have access to international financing, i.e. development banks, export finance agencies, etc.?
I personally would hope not. In practice, reality does tend to take over. And although most of those organizations would probably say they're not going to deal with pushists right now, give it time, who knows, humanitarian forces come into play, international NGOs come into play, and so forth. At the moment, I think there is this, Niger is the last domino to fall, so to speak. I think there'll be more resistance from the outside world to help the pushists in Niger than there might be elsewhere. And look at Mali. Have they had any help from the outside world? Not much. They've been around for a couple of years. They're having a hard time. So I think the international community will take a tougher line now than it has done in the past. I hope so, because if they don't, I think it becomes a real problem.
Okay. Now that Prigozhin is dead, do you expect Wagner to be able to carry on in the same way that it has done in the Sahel?
Frankly, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows really what is going to happen to Wagner. I think there are I think possibly yes. I think the answer is Moscow. There appear to be competing forces within the Kremlin circle as to how they will run it, take it over, and so forth. They might parcel it up regionally, put it under different class. I don't know, but I don't think we're going to see the end of it, because I think it's too profitable for Russia. It's causing a lot of trouble. It's causing a lot of the distress. There have been some bad news coming through just now, which I haven't got the details of. The more Russia can cause chaos in this area, the better for Russia's wider interests. So I think they'll try and keep it there. The danger is that these Russian Wagner units become, their own militaries, but they take control themselves. They're a pretty dangerous group, pretty nasty people. When they do massacres, they do a pretty good job. It's pretty horrific stuff from what I've seen of them, but I can't really give an honest answer to that.
We've got a number of other questions, so if we can go through them as quickly as possible. What's the terrorist risk for the capital cities in the Sahel?
What's the terrorist what?
Risk for the capital cities in the Sahel, i.e. Niamey and Bamako.
Yeah. Well, they've sort of kept out of them for the time being. You've got to go back to the earlier big bombings in the hotels, which was going back a few years. They could start that sort of campaign again quite easily. They haven't done so yet. They're more absorbed with taking over large swathes of rural areas. And you've got to think that, in fact, Niamey is very close to the Three Borders area. So far, they've tended to steer away from those areas, but that could change if they change their strategy towards them. So at the moment, maybe not so serious, but things could change very quickly. And the security forces in those areas, of course, are pretty fragile and weak. So if they wanted to go in, I think they could do, and they could cause a lot. But there are more complications there, which I got time to pick up on.
All right. Are the uranium mining areas in northern Niger, are they vulnerable to jihadist attacks?
I would say no, for one very good reason, that they're up into mostly Tuareg country. And if you take that area, I'll call it Agadez, the region of Agadez as a whole, which is the biggest administrative region in Africa, actually. Jihadists haven't fared very well up there, because when they have got into the area, they've tended to meet with their own medicine. They've had their own throats slit. I shouldn't say that, but Tuareg deal with them pretty strongly. You've got Tuareg militia up there, some of which are helping the mines, the Iranian people, they're close to them. So at the moment, I would have thought the uranium area of there is relatively safe, but things could change, very quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What's the influence of the Northern Hausa elite in Nigeria? What's their influence in Niger?
Sorry, what is the link?
What is the influence of the Northern Hausa elite in northern Nigeria on Niger?
Very strong, because apart from the fact they speak the same language, the same ethnic group, you've also got religious ties through the area of Sokoto. And southern Niger, in colonial times, was of course part of Nigeria. Treaty of Berlin, if I'm right, sort of carved it up. So southern Niger is very, very close to northern Nigeria, hence the lack of any desire for military interventions there. And I think that answers the question. So very close.
Okay. Given the failure or failings of the Niger junta, what are the chances of a second coup?
Chances of a secondary coup?
Second coup, another one.
In Niger?
Yes.
I think high. But if you asked me for evidence, a bit thin. I'm not sure if the armed forces are all divided, are all behind the junta. They probably know it's a personal objective, etc. And there are one or two other people with personal reasons in there. The Isufu factor splits everything. He's a problem and has been a problem. So there are divisions coming in there. The political opposition is a bit dodgy because they're taking advantage of this. I see Hama Amadou has come back into the country. So the political opposition, which would have been all pro-democratic, etc., might see an opportunity of backing the present pushes. That's a bit up in the air. I don't think we're going to see the Risa syndrome that taking up arms there. So I think it is a possibility, but there's also this feeling that nobody wants bloodshed. So it could be a quiet little coup, if you know what I mean, within the inner circle to get out of the impasse they've got themselves into. So
okay.
Yeah, I would put it at 50-50.
Okay. What's the role of Chad, the role and position of Chad in the whole of this?
Chad's got its own problems. It's not directly involved at the moment, bearing in mind that the regime in Chad was also the result of a coup. That was Déby's father was killed, almost certainly by his own people, and his position is politically dodgy. It's probably becoming even more dodgy insofar as it's very dependent on French support. And when France begins to realize its own difficult position in Africa, will France continue to bail out the Déby regime or not? So there's no direct involvement with Niger, except they've offered intervention to mediate. They could become a mediatory power in a sense. I don't think so, because Chad itself doesn't have any credibility, at the political level. So it's another question mark hanging over the area. Chad has other problems on the Sudan front, so the other side of Chad, and in the south as well. So Chad has problems on every side, from the north, from Libya, from Sudan, from the south. So, Chad's got enough problems to be getting on with without involving itself further afield. So,
okay. I think we'll have one more question. That is, are there other countries where you can expect a coup?
I think all the Francophone countries are vulnerable, some more than others. The former British colonies, less so, but none of them are averse, because coups are becoming a bit of a sort of regular way of doing business in this part of the world. If you want to change the government, well, have a coup. It's about the only way you can change government, because when you have rigged elections, how do you get rid of the people in power? You know, particularly if they're worth getting rid of, if you know what I mean. So I think you have got all of the French states. Gabon was a very good example. I think most people would have been glad to see the back of the Bongo family, appalling crowd. So a lot of people there, you know, outside would say good for the coupists. So you've got to measure almost each coup in terms of who's been got rid of, but they're all very vulnerable because it's become almost a sort of easy way of doing business or getting rid of people. And also, ECOWAS so far has never really stepped in. No one has really stepped in to put a stop to this pattern. And this is why Niger is so important. If Niger is stopped either through a secondary coup or through intervention, it may put a check. But one looks to Cote d'Ivoire, one looks to Benin, to Togo. All these countries, to me, look as if they could be a little bit vulnerable for all sorts of different reasons.
Okay.
But they do have that one thing in common, that is France-Afrique. And they also have Russian propaganda for feeding in on them too.
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much.